ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Fondation Beyeler and UBS, I wish you a warm evening. Also to the audience which we have online on the live streaming. For the artist talk with Rirkrit Tiravanija, in conversation, and we hope tonight you're all going to have a good experience. Rirkrit and Mr. Poshyananda know each other for 30 years, so they know each other really well. Let's find out if they have something new to say to each other. I also wish to thank the National Gallery of Singapore, who's hosting us here in this beautiful venue. And I wish to also thank SDPI, who has been a great help in organizing this event and also support coming from our Basel. So enjoy the evening, and we're curious to hear you speaking.
Thank you, Sam. Yeah, I'm curious to hear what I have to say too. Well, maybe Apinan could. I mean, we were just saying that we've met each other like 30 years ago, when I guess Apinan was still just doing his PhD in Cornell in the US. And he was coming to do, I don't know, the paper he was writing on, he was doing research on artists in New York. And he visited Robert Longo's studio of artists, American artists, who I was working with his girlfriend then as an assistant. And I think Robert said to Apinan, oh, you should go and meet this Thai artist guy who's working, you know. So he came and to the studio, and that's the first time we met. And at that time, I was still, you know, kind of like, I was finishing school, and I was, you know, working as an assistant to artists, and I was installing shows for galleries in New York. And I hadn't, at that time, come back to Thailand for a long time because, you know, like when you're there as a student, you know, you kind of don't want to leave because it's very difficult anyway to return. So I was still trying to like survive in New York and to try to, you know, have some kind of career or some kind of connection with the art world. And so then Apinan came, and he was really like the only connection I had to Thai art world at that time. You know, when I left Thailand, finished high school, I left Thailand. At that time, I didn't know I was going to become an artist. And this was like, I was already 19 years old. And partly because you know, I don't know how, but maybe he could talk a little bit on his side. But on my side, I never really had any exposure to art at all. Like, you know, maybe I might know Picasso, and that's about it. So I never really had any relationship to art until I went to, actually went to Canada. And I had wanted to become a photojournalist, so it wasn't like that far out of the way, but I never really had an art relationship. I had a more like a journalistic, you know, photography relationship. So I wanted to be a photojournalist. My father was, of course, a civil servant in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And every day when we drove to school in traffic, he would tell me about how never ever to become a Thai civil servant, ever. So I was like, okay, how do I become self-determined and not be working for the government? And so that part, you know, kind of embedded in me, like the need to be, in a way, like free and, you know. So I was very interested in photography in high school, and so that's the direction. And when I landed in Ottawa, which is where my father was posted, I went to like some pre-college classes, and I went into the history department to, you know, to put my direction towards journalism. And I went to some art history classes, basic, you know, modern art history, history of photography, Canadian art history. And in this moment when I was kind of sitting in this kind of history class, the modern art history class, they would flash on the slide of like the very important kind of key works of each different times and period. And I recalled like seeing, first actually I saw a Malevich white on white, right? Constructivist, suprematist. And of course the lecturer was talking about how, it was kind of spiritual art, but with this kind of political, ideological, and I was like, oh, that's really interesting to me. And then a week or two later was like Marcel Duchamp's Urinal. And that really kind of, I was saying to Sam, it really gave me a kind of epiphany that maybe this is actually something I would like to be interested in or doing. And that was when I started to change my direction towards really finding out what it is that is art and how could one become an artist not knowing anything. And so that was kind of a funny beginning. And I always would say, often when I give a talk, that I feel like I just kind of fell into art. And I still feel like I still fall into things as I go along. And in a funny way, I'm kind of interested in doing that constantly, and in a way, to keep it very open and not to be so highly professional, right? Because when you're too professionalized, you start to know too much what you're going to do. And I like to not know what I'm going to do next. So, and then when we met, Apinan was writing his paper, and then and then soon after that, actually, I came back to Thailand, and I met him. Of course, we called him, met him in Thailand, and then that's how, I start to find out actually about the Thai art scene, which is something I had really no relationship to or no information to. And even like for many, many years, in a way, like the Thai art establishment was very resigned to like accept me in a way, because I never went through the system in Thailand. So they didn't know who I was. So to them, I was like a kind of foreign object. They thought I was like a kind of, Thai born in the States, had no relationship to Thailand. And the funny story is that, in fact, and I only found this out later after I came back more, that half of my cousins all went to art school. They went to architecture, they went to design, they went to photography, but they all went through the Thai, the main Thai art school. And I didn't know that until later. And then not only that, I also have a kind of an uncle-in-law who's like a very important Thai sculptor, who only later on I found out. And so in a way, it became like, oh, well, actually, they suddenly realized this guy is not he's actually family, but just like, lost part of the family or something. So.
Yeah, from my side, so 1988, I think that was when we crossed paths, and I was, like Rirkrit said, I was doing some interviews. I had this small grant from the Asian Cultural Council, Rockefeller, to stay in New York. And I was interviewing Nam Chun Paik, Richard Serra, Robert Longo, Jonathan Borowski. But then there was a mention of this emerging talent who happens to be Thai. And I just took this chance that I must meet him, because from what I've heard and from what he was doing, and he invited me to have a meal, a dinner at his East Village home. So it was a privilege to have Rirkrit cook for me, one-on-one, 1988. So our friendship started from there, and like Rirkrit said, that it was a very interesting time for art. We've had the Magician de la Terre at the time, more than that, previously we had the Primitivism show, and he sort of burst into the New York art scene, and you were having shows, Pad Thai 1990, and then you had the Whitney Biennale show, and then the Aperto in Venice Biennale in 1993. So it was like something that I was so glad to follow this artist. But like Rirkrit, I did not go through the Thai academia. Like Rirkrit, I studied abroad for a long time. So there was this parallel whereby both of us could see the art scene from the outside. So in that way, we shared a lot of common inquisitiveness. So I think the friendship sort of grew, and I think it came more and more intense around, I think, 1990s, when 1996, 97, when I was curating this show called Traditions Tensions in New York, and then followed by Montien Bunma exhibition around 2000 when he just passed away. And Rirkrit came to this exhibition, and we continued, and then 2003 came. It was Venice Biennale, where you were co-curating with Hans and Francesco Bonami. And I remember very well in your Ver gallery at the time, on top of 7-Eleven in Chao Phraya River. We had a very brief conversation, and we had an idea that, why not have a pavilion of Thailand for the first time at Venice Biennale. So this is a guy, not only the artist, but this is a guy who actually pushed Thai artists to be on stage, for the first time at the Venice Biennale, which is a big, big thing, because the big thing was that we had no money. So we had to design something or create something, and we decided to actually build a pavilion at the Piazza Garibaldi, near the vicinity of the Giardini. And, Rirkrit helped us to get the space, and we created our own pavilion, which was very exciting. And I think it actually showed that his talent, whereby he's not just an artist, but his ability to move into various positions, but the way he looks at it, and this person is he's a gentleman. I feel that, over the years I meet him or have, come across and work with him, never seen him, angry, or I don't know, but never seen you angry or throwing tantrums like many artists do. But I think it's a way that he can maneuver and be in between. I call it the in-between spaces, whereby the social engagement, the community, and the art and what is not art is always there. So it's very ephemeral, but very, very exciting. And it's the moment when he creates his art. It's the moment that we share. And it's the word of mouth that the people experience this, and it continues. And call it what you like, relational aesthetics or whatever. I think it's a way that he can move our thinking to be outside the box, to be outside the academia, or be outside the context of art or art history. This is something that I think he's actually put Southeast Asia or Asian art on the map.
Any questions? No, and I think, I remember talking to Apinan earlier on. At that time, he was still writing for the Bangkok Post as a critic, and, coming back to Thailand. And we were talking about how it was very difficult to be critical in Thai culture, right? Because, of course, we have this kind of relationship to the respect to the elders, and we can't really say things very directly about how we feel about the elder. And so it was very hard for him to write criticism about, certain art that he was seeing that he had to address. And so this has always been, in a way, I mean, when I returned to Thailand, the first thing I tried to do, of course, was to try to develop a kind of a space or a kind of condition where younger people, younger artists, would have a space to say what they think, you know, and they can criticize me as a first primary example, you know, in a sense, so that they could start to have some kind of, a position of critical stance, and that, of course, that they should question, you know, at least directly for me, my work, because I felt that that was one way for younger Thai artists to develop themselves, right? Because if they can't have this kind of questioning, then we won't be able to like move forward in a sense. So in that sense, when I first came back to Thailand, I started an office, which now has become, in a sense, became a kind of a gallery or exhibition space. But it was trying, in a way, to like find a space for younger people to be able to develop, you know, their ideas freely without kind of, without a certain kind of, yeah, like, restriction of their thinking. And also, at that time, I met my friend Kamin Lechai Prasad, this other Thai artist in Chiang Mai. And so we also have the same ideas about how we could like try to, in a way, cultivate younger people. And so we developed this space, which is the Land Foundation. And part of that was also kind of a platform for like many different ideas, but one part of that idea is to like be able to have a space for younger people to, you know, develop their ideas. And I think that's always kind of like a very critical, important part now, even for us in Thailand. And I think, I mean, of course, now we have different biennials in Thailand that just happened, you know, so I think that is kind of, you know, come to a certain point. But at the same time, we don't have the same structure and the same kinds of support for the art, you know, or collection of art or for the artists. And I think that's partly difficult, but partly also good, because I think the artists who are surviving and continue to make art, of course, has to be very self-sufficient, very self-organized. And in that sense, I think that it also strengthens their idea and their development. Yeah. What else can we talk about?
Well, let's talk about food, because
Food.
that's how people relate to you. You know, how do you go about preparing or designing to cook pad thai for 2,000 people?
Well, actually, yeah. I mean, I spoke a little bit in recently in this interview in the Straits Times about. Actually, I'm working on a new cookbook with a friend, and I had a recent interview with another person recently, and I was talking about how, you know, when I first started to, I mean, the idea of making food came from a lot of different layers of things. And originally it came basically out of the idea of a kind of certain kinds of relationship to museology, right? So I was studying in Chicago at the Art Institute of Chicago, which is a kind of like, you know, a fairly extensive, rich museum with a big collection of very different kinds of art and cultural artifacts. And actually, they have one of the biggest kind of Thai kind of collection of Thai artifact in the museum. Partly because there was a dentist in Chicago who was collecting, you know, Thai Buddhist art and potteries and things. So they had a very good collection there. And so when I was in at the school there, I would go to the museum and I would go and look at this collection. And of course, it's kind of like a many combination of thinking and moment when, you know, the art world in New York was questioning a lot like the idea of authenticity. and the idea of authorship. But also in that relationship, the question of like, in a way, a kind of starting a kind of critical questioning of the institution of collecting. So, you know, which now becomes a kind of post-colonial, you know, critique. So I was kind of looking at these things, and I was like looking at the Buddhas, and I was like, well, the objects are somehow kind of, I mean, they are not, I mean, my relationship to these things are more like in a kind of daily use. They're actually things I use. They're not something separated from my life. But in this kind of place, in this kind of museum structure, they had, in a sense, become like recontextualized into objects. And I was saying to myself, how do I find a way to retrieve the life around the object, you know, so that one actually understands not the object, but actually the people around it. And in a way, food is something that very, you know, is very kind of very, it's very everyday, but also it's something that we all share. But within that, there's complexities and layers of it. So that's how I, you know, I like to say that basically I took the, you know, the pottery out of the kind of cabinets of the museum and like basically use it to cook again. My analogy at one point was like, so it's like taking Duchamp's urinal and then putting it on the wall and then pissing into it. And I think it's a very clear analogy, right? Because for myself as an artist, you know, after the urinal, you have to go, so what can you make after that? Like as a sculptor, how can you make sculpture after the urinal? Because it's like you could just buy the thing from the hardware store and you could recontextualize it as art. So how do you continue to then make things which are, in a way, everything is then already art? And in that sense, you know, to take the urinal, put it back on the wall, and taking action, I mean, the action itself is then again could be, you know, the way to extend it again, to extend the question. And I think the part of the action is very much also like becomes a kind of relational structure, right? So then we all can act, and somehow to find a way to make a space that gives people the right or the freedom to act, you know, which is something I think we tend to forget, that art was always trying to give people, you know, an opportunity to act, right? To think freely, to see freely, to hear freely. So in that sense, it was kind of, yeah, important to me. So, and then of course, because food somehow is something very common, you know, that can transcend in a way, at least it kind of opens things up. Even if you couldn't eat spicy Thai curry, you understood that you could eat it. And then you would have an experience with it. And that experience could be painful, and it could also be pleasurable, right? And it's always been a kind of thing where you see people who've never tasted, you know, spicy food before, and once they start to have a little bit of it, they start to continue to, you know, grow with it. Like they start to have the tongue for it. And so in that sense, it's almost like you start to open yourself up more to the thing you were never, you know, having a relationship to. And it's always for me a kind of like, I always say, you know, I try to make this kind of line where people have to cross. And once you cross it, then you can experience other things. You can kind of maybe come to certain kind of, maybe some kind of conscious realization that you could go there to the place you were never going to go, and you would survive, right? And maybe even enjoy it. So when I first started, I mean, of course, I was making, I actually made a curry, the first dish that I made, but it was just for like viewing. The first piece I made was a kind of little display of curry that was being cooked but it was never consumed. People were just standing around looking at it. And of course, then I realized I was just repeating the thing I was trying not to do, right? And that's the thing, like I said, you know, I feel like I just stumbled through life, right? Because then you do that, and then you realize, oh, people are just standing around looking at it. But they were doing other things, right? So when there was an opening, you know, everybody had a drink, and then they put all their drinks on the pedestal of the work, because somehow that was just natural to them too, because it looked like that's a place they could put. So then I realized there's an interaction that needs to be kind of extended. And so, of course, then the first piece where people participated, or people, you know, had a chance to eat the food, was pad thai. And in a way, I still, you know, this is like very early on, and I would say I still had certain ideas about what I was trying to do, which in a way, like, again, like having done it, then one realizes like what could be even better, you know, in that sense. So it's always good when you make a work and you realize that there's actually more to be done, you know, rather than the thing is like, oh, you've done it and it's done, you know. So that's what I mean by stumbling always, because I feel like it should always be a kind of a little bit of a mistake that can then be, you know, try to be like extended, or that the mistake could always be working towards something else better. So, yeah.
So this cultural retrieval that began in the museum in Chicago, I think you were asking some questions that actually, you know, museums are treated as a temple of the art. And when you go and see it, you see Buddha images or sacred images on pedestal or sometimes on the vitrines. And you cannot touch it, it's like drained, the spirit is taken out, and it's treated or regarded as artifacts, as sacred object, but in museum context. So by trying to put the spirits back into it, I think you were also trying to ask yourself about your identity, whereby, you know, who am I? You know, just because the name tag is saying that Thai art, you know, in the museum context. This label may also actually imply that, you know, how did the items or the objects came to Chicago, pillaged, stolen, or whatever. How did this dentist got the images or the artifacts or the items? So I think you were asking, intentionally or not, many questions. And what you're trying to show about the identity of yourself or Thainess. You know, in this day and age, we talk about a lot of, you know, Asianness or Thainess, the exotica of food or whatever, but you were also asking, you know, this self-projection of self-exoticization is something questionable also, because we are all labeled. But because you're crossing so many areas in terms of presentation, and it happens to be food, which I see it as performance, in such a way that it could be long durational or it could be very impromptu. But we must realize that you're not just using food, but you have developed in such a way that you use so many other materials. You do film, ceramics, woodcut, in all these areas where you touch. It seems to be, you know, even here when you do the printmaking, it's almost like cooking. It's almost like, you know, very, very delicate way of cooking on the printing machine. So in this way, it's like you leave your marks in such a way that each material or the medium you touch, you also ask the question. But what I want to ask you is that when you go back home, it's like the prodigal son come back to Thailand, and how they misread you, which I think is good, because they would always misread you, and they don't realize the impact on what you've done, not just for the Thai art world, but to the Asian or the world art. They don't realize it, but when you go back, they still stereotype you as, okay, this artist who made a lot of work regarding pad Thai. But they don't understand Land Foundation. They don't even understand Ver Gallery. And you know, in this way, how can we actually educate, you know, the civil servant artists or even the Thai audience to be more adventurous. And your most recent work, you actually put your artwork in the museum, in the palace. So tell us about this.
Yeah. No, I mean, I like that it's not, I like that there is not completely understanding, because again, then there is always something to work on. Because of course, I always said if everything was clear and understood, then I probably should stop, you know. And I always hope that it would be sooner rather than later. No, so Apinan's just talking about a show that just opened recently in Bangkok. And the context is that in Bangkok we have the National Museum, which is a museum of antiquities, you know, Thai antique objects. But this museum is actually a palace, was a palace. And so in one of the main buildings, so they call it the front palace. And the front palace is the palace, I mean, there's a whole history around this idea. So it's not the main palace, it's the brother of the king, who is thrown, he's like a second king, but he's like a minister. So he's like the face of the palace. And how, you know, and so there's a whole kind of history around that. But also I think one of the main part of this is the fact that this reign was, in a sense, trying to become more accessible, you know, rather than, you know,
More humane.
Yeah, more human in that sense. I mean, and so there's a whole relationship to how the king calls himself and how they name themselves, and how the history of this naming, which is always very interesting to me, this idea of naming, that, you know, they were trying to then kind of put themselves in a place of like, not common, but kind of to call themselves more like human rather than deity, right? Because usually they are trying to present themselves as a deity and as related to like the higher being. But in this reign, they were trying to like become more common. So they start to describe themselves as like human, and it's a kind of like a small but significant note. And so and they're renovating the space in the museum, and so it's empty. And one of the princes who is a worker in this museum, in her interest, wanted to kind of make this kind of relationship or representation, but also at the same time to make a discourse more into the contemporary structure. So she wants to, you know, that idea of the old, but to relate it more to contemporary structure. So she's inviting contemporary artists to develop a project in this particular space. And I could see, I mean, and it's, you know, it's a touchy political space for me, because of course I'm a anti-institutional person by nature, right? So in order to do something in a kind of institutional space, you have to, it's a kind of difficult thing. It's a line to draw. And but this naming thing became very interesting for me. So I used that as a kind of, actually the content of my work. And in order to enter into this, what was used to be a palace, there are doors, and there are 3 doors. There's a main door in the center and 2 doors on the side. And these 2 doors on the side are kind of like the doors for commoners to enter. I mean, and commoners who enter this is not that common. I mean, they're working in this particular space. But anyway, that's the idea, that they're not the king. You know, the door of the king is the middle door. So these 2 doors are open, and usually when you enter into it, there's a kind of a mirror that stands in front of this door towards the throne. So the idea is that you don't directly enter and look directly at the throne and the king, or, you know. And so it's a kind of a space that is a kind of a void. And they called it a kind of, in Thai, it's like, yeah, it's the void. And it's a mirror. So you come in and you would see yourself reflected. And then you'd have to go around it in order to enter the room. And so these two mirrors are in the collection. So I used the two mirrors, and I made a new project, which is a kind of an augmented reality thing. So you come with your phone, and when you point your phone at this mirror, a ghost comes out, and the ghost starts to basically ask questions about your name or being named, or what does it mean to be named, or what does it mean to have a name, or how is it that one is called something, you know. So it's kind of like, in a way, a relationship to this idea of identity. But also, I mean, for me, it's kind of like, but that identity is, of course, questioning the identity of, like, the institution, right? Like, how does one become named so and not so, you know? Yeah.
So let's talk about name now. A lot of people call you Rirkrit Tiravanija. So in Thai, we call you Rirkrit Tiravanija. So Rirkrit, Rirk means auspicious. Rit means supernatural power. So Mr. Supernatural Power Auspiciousness is Rirkrit. So I think, you know, I don't know who named you, whether your father or your parents or the previous king or the previous spirits, I don't know. But I think we should now realize the name and the meaning of Rirkrit Tiravanija is actually Rirkrit. So now we know that you are a supernatural person.
Yeah. No, well, and that actually comes back again to this, actually, the work I just mentioned, because interestingly, my great-grandfather was Chinese. He had no Thai name, but he was a civil servant. He was a school headmaster. And I guess Riehen Rama VI gave the names to the Chinese to basically repatriate, you know, people who had, you know. So in that sense, the last name Tiravanit was given to us by the king, you know. So we didn't have a name until, a Thai name, until this was given to us. And it's always like, my father always, you know, was very proud of this fact that we were given a Thai name. And it's interesting because there's a certificate for it, and on the certificate it tells you exactly how to write it in Thai and how to write it in English, right? And so in Thai it's Tiravanit, but in English it's written Tiravanija. And of course it has to do with a kind of transliteration of Thai into English. So everybody reads it Tiravanija, and then I can't say it's Tiravanit. They would never, nobody understands like why, you know, like it looks like this but sounds like something else. So this is always, but I think it's, again, like the naming and things like that, it's very much, I mean, for me, having been to the West, you know, and understanding in a way, like, in a sense that to be able to name something or to be able to have a name is a certain kind of knowledge, right? There's a certain kind of idea of knowledge that one is identified, you know. To be identified is to be known, right? And then to be known is therefore like has some kind of relation, you know, has some kind of power structure, you know. So I think always that it was always important in a way, like this kind of naming and being named, or the idea of being called, or the miscalled, right? To be mispronounced was always important to me. So I would never correct it, because in a sense it was about that, right? Like that it should never, like that in a sense, like one could never say it correctly because one didn't really know, right? And even in Thailand, you know, today I would say to people my name, Rirkrit, and they wouldn't be able to say it because it's like a rolling of the alphabets which they no longer really use. They would never put, of course my father made the name, and it's like Sanskrit, right? It's a combination of Sanskrit words, so it's like Latin, you put two things together to make this thing. And he was always very specific about language. He was always very concerned about how it's correctly used and how it's, you know, so he had this kind of idea, which, you know, was interesting. But yeah, it comes, you know, again into
That
this.
could be your new project.
Yeah. No, it's a very old project. No, but, you know, I mean, I was always very interested in, of course, I mean, when I then start art school, you know, the first thing I made was, of course, the first Thai alphabet, which was Gõ Kai. You know, it's the first alphabet of the Thai letter. So like A, and this was Gõ Kai. And again, it has something to do with this kind of idea of identity and language and self, right? And where to locate, you know, yourself within. For me, it was how to locate myself in this other place, you know, how to locate myself. I mean, when I entered art school, the first thing I said to myself was, how am I going to make art back in Thailand? You know, that was my concern. Like, what is it going to mean to people back in Thailand that I'm making this thing? And it has, of course, to do with the fact that I had no idea what was going on in Thailand art-wise, you know. But so it was always like about returning. And then, you know, when I came back to Thailand, I mean, I had like some resistance in terms of like the older school were like making fun of me. I was on on the first main trip when I came back to Thailand, I was invited by a young artist, Navin Ravanchaikul, who's in Chiang Mai. He invited me to come to Chiang Mai to be on a panel which we were on together. Was a Toshiba like educational art education, you know. And we were on a panel called How Can Thai Art Become More International, right? And when I was on that panel, you know, I gave a, you know, talk about the idea, like what does it mean to be operating outside of Thailand and in this kind of climate. And one of very important Thai artists stood up and you know, and this is like everybody in Thailand knows this. He stood up and he said, so if my wife makes the pad Thai, is this art? You know, that's his question to me, right? And my reply was, if you invite me to your house, yes. You know, so, but, you know, and that's kind of like the relationship. And then I was 2 weeks later, I was on another panel in Bangkok. And we had you know, the moderator was there and a few people together, and we were talking. I was speaking in Thai. And then we got onto the, you know, sitting on the panel, and the first thing the moderator said was, please excuse Rirkrit if he can't speak Thai very well. Right? And I'm like, but I just sat there and spoke Thai to all of you, right? So, you know, there's this kind of like slight that, you know, they were doing, like the older, but, you know, but it's all, for me, it was all in good time, because I think it was part of, you know, in a way, the misunderstanding or the kind of resistance is important in a sense for me to feel the need to continue to do things, you know. And also was, I must say, like, I don't really, in a sense, I don't really show my art in Thailand in many ways. So I work with the Land Foundation. I've developed this gallery and space. But in a way, for me, it was so never necessary to actually try to show my work, because there's so much of my work everywhere already. You know, it's not really.
When you had your first solo show in 2010, just prior to that, a few weeks before that, it was a big political event of burning of Bangkok. Bangkok got burned. So we had to do something in terms of the art world. So I invited Rirkrit to co-create a show with me called Imagine Peace. And after the opening of that exhibition, we got a lot of criticism because we invited both the red shirts and the yellow shirts artists to work together. But then Rirkrit had, oh, should I call you Rirkrit? Rirkrit had a solo show at 100 Tonson Gallery. And it was a big turn up of people because it was a show that his first solo show in Bangkok, but it was very political. And he asked a lot of young students as well as the viewers to draw impromptu on the wall. But he started with, I think Kamin maybe first started some drawings, and the students came, and it's about going back political images of political events, coup d'etats, all the uprisings in the 1970s, 90s, and to the present. And it was called Who's Afraid of?
Yellow, red, and green.
So very significant because talking about colors, talking about status, talking about whose side you're on. And it's only like 300 meters away from the actual riots and demonstrations. So we had a discussion about it, and he made the event of cooking red, yellow, green curry to the audience. And it was, again, very ephemeral, murky event whereby just a few blocks away people were still going through the riots or the aftermath of the riots. But then they asked questions, and the images were very blatant, very straightforward. So it's not as if he was shying away of politics. He was actually confronting it in such a way that the participants have to ask questions, what they're going to draw, what are they going to put on. And it got to the point where all the images were drawn to the point where blackness came. It obliterated the wall into blackness. And I think this is a very phenomenal event that has to be marked as one of the most important events regarding political art, which Rirkrit contributed to the history of Thai art. Now, in 2 days' time, we're going to have to go back and do our election. So we just hope that you don't do another Who's Afraid of later.
No, I don't. Yeah, I don't think we will. I don't know. We'll see. But I mean, I'm happy to see that the election is not moved or delayed or postponed again, right? So it was postponed already, and in fact, I have work ready to show if it was postponed. So. No, but also interestingly, this work will now be, it's been acquired by a museum in actually Washington, D.C., and it's going to be actually because of, it's the Hirshhorn Museum, and it's supposed to be up right now, like this month, but then because there was a government shutdown for like 36 days or something, so all the Hirshhorn is part of the Smithsonian, and so they were shut down so everything has been delayed. So the show will now start like in May, and it's going to be, Who's Afraid of Red, Yellow, and Green in Washington, D.C. So it's going to be the kind of layers and history of Thai demonstration and Thai political, manifestation in Washington, D.C., when there are all these other things also happening just outside. So it would be interesting to see. Yeah.
You gave us the honor to be the international advisor of the first Bangkok Art Biennale in 2018. We're going to have our Bangkok Art Biennale 2020 actually next year. And the theme of the show, in fact, it's going to be announced right now for the first time, is escape routes. Today, just now. So we invite Rirkrit to be one of the artists. So we hope very much that you can do public work, something to interact with the audience, because in 2018, Bangkok Art Biennale, we actually had 20 venues, and where we used temples, heritage sites, and public spaces as well. So do you have anything in mind?
No. But I'm just interested in why okay, you always have this kind of title. And so what are you thinking in terms of what does it mean, escape route?
Okay. So the last Bangkok Art Biennale we call Beyond Bliss. Beyond Bliss was something to ask. It was a very paradoxical theme, in fact, because how can you achieve bliss, and how can you go beyond it? It's not necessarily a Buddhist thing, but to have too much happiness, to have excessive happiness, in Buddhist terms, is to have greed and suffering. So you must have just enough happiness to prolong it, to have it long lasting. Otherwise, you become lustful, you become greedy. So these were the theme that we presented to artists like Marina Abramovich, to Yoshitomo Nara, to many artists to interpret it. But in this theme, we call it escape routes. I think very much the obvious situation that we face now. I'm sure people in Paris are trying to find escape routes. Brexit is trying to find escape routes. Thailand in 2 days' time is trying to find escape routes. So it's more social, political, and I think the artists have special antennas. They want to be critical. They want to, confront with many issues. But here we're just talking about in terms of survival, sufficiency, and sustainability. And these are the questions, the pressing questions that we all are facing. Not just people in the art world, but everybody, whether it be environment, pollution, disease, sexism, terrorism, whatever. I think this is an opening up, and especially to place it in context of Bangkok would be very exciting and meaningful.
Do we have questions? I think, we can open up for questions. Yes. Should we use the microphone?
I'm not going to try and say your names. So my name is Lili. It's so easy. It repeats itself. Li. So I live in Singapore, and it's really great to see both of you speak. I can't say your names, but I know your works. So I'm very happy to hear you speak. I have a question on audience engagement. To be honest, I never got past Pad Thai. And I still think that what you and Koki Tanaka, what he does, after the tsunami and the earthquakes and all that in Japan, trying to get people together. My question is one of whether you think this is good enough, that it's a one-off, that people come and eat and then they go home and then go on to the next thing. Or do you find, or are you bothered by the fact that you need to sustain this? And maybe you sustain it by having additional shows and doing a cookbook. And by the way, I just started collecting artist cookbooks. And I have the Dali one, I just got it. And I just think it's fantastic that artists put these kinds of things out. So my question is one of when you do shows that have social engagement, is it important to just do it once and just have a big bang, and then maybe do another show that's kind of adjacent to it? Or do you think it's a good idea that you need to continue that conversation? And how do you do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a lifelong work, and I think one also understands that, at least as myself, that there are limitations to what one can do always. But I'm always, I would say that the practice is to not, I do things outside of exhibition as well. So I'm a teacher, and we have this like a foundation in Thailand. I'm engaged with other people in other places. So it's not so much like that one needs to actually be visible in a way when you come to talk about like real engagement. Because real engagement is partly you should just come to my house and eat, you know, and not be in an exhibition space. But that's kind of like ongoing. It doesn't, you know, it doesn't stop just because the show ends. So for me, it doesn't ever stop. It's always on, right? Yeah, and I think that kind of, I mean, at least in what I'm interested in, it's always ongoing, you know. Yeah, I never orchestrated anything. So, yeah, yes, let it go. But I would say, of course, like it's just, you know, just in myself, in my own practice, in my own interest, that my relationship to everyone who I meet is on the same level of engagement. So, and my concerns, our hope are, you know, yeah, transferred and given or received. So yeah, but it's never, you know, one never could ever, you know, feed the whole world. I fed many once and many times, yes. Um, yeah, no, it's so I would say yes, it's always ongoing and I mean I think one of the things always, of course, like you know, being who I am and having been given my whatever position, that I'm very concerned about just being pigeonholed, right? So I try to, I mean, you know, do many different things and to find many different layers of like practice and engagement. So it's never, food is just one part of it. And then at this point, you know, of course, you know, I mean, it's just like normal. It's like a, you know, everyday thing. But on the other hand, I teach and I meet a lot of students. I've been teaching for more than 10 years and then I realized, wow, you know, there's like 1,000 more people that I've been closely engaged to in relationship to like how I think and what I do, or at least like what I think is important in terms of like what we need to think as an artist, and how do we resist certain relationships that's, you know, goes on with art and things like that. So yeah, it's never ends. Um, and I hope, you know, to, I mean, I speak about like, you know, kind of idea of like having done everything and then stopping. But of course, there, as an artist, you never stop, doesn't matter what, you know. It's just how you engage.
I have a question. No, in terms of performance and directing, for example, your project on the Divine Comedy and the El Tempo di Postino, can you tell us about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I mean, the Divine Comedy is a very, I mean, the setting and those things are very specific. And, you know, when I work, it's always very much contextual, you know, in terms of like what I'm trying to deal with is that moment or this particular group of people sitting here, you know, so I'm always working with the situation I'm in. So I'm given a certain structure and I try to deal with that structure, and within that I try to fold it in and out of itself and you know, try to both be engaging and also questioning, you know. So, and I, you know, yeah. But I think it's also interesting because at some point after having done so many things, people's, I mean, there are different receptions of like, or expectations of the work, like what one does. And of course, when I do certain things, and those two conditions are much more, in a way, I would say, staged and performed, and I would even say it's like theater in that sense. And I think that I'm interested in that relationship in terms of like how you are within it, but also like standing back and looking at it. So in a way, it's also trying to make you more, again, conscious of your situation in the situation, right? Because in a way, the idea of relational structure is about your engagement with the space you're in, with the people you're in with. But often, like, one doesn't realize one is doing that, right? Because we are just doing what we think is our normal experience. And so in some way, the idea of setting it a little bit like a theater is to kind of make you realize you're actually looking and watching, and therefore you could actually be more, you could be paying more attention to the things that's happening around you. Which is what I always hope, like with all kinds of relation, that we are aware that we're engaged with the other, and that we are always, in that awareness, one is engaging with the other. Yes.
Yeah, so I thought it was beautiful how you described your desire to create spaces in Thailand when you came back for younger people to have a space for expression and creation. And I just wondered, have you ever had a similar desire in New York or Berlin, which are also two of your homes where, younger generations might need similar spaces, even if it seems maybe from the outside that we have more of them?
Yeah. Yeah, yes. So, I mean, we've always talked, and this is not just myself alone, because I have friends who are also interested in the same things and interested in trying to engage, in a bigger structure. And I mean, I'm teaching in New York at this university, and one of the problems with teaching at the university is the fact that, the young artists who have to come there has to pay. They have to pay a lot of money to go to the school. And it's becoming like absurd, right, as a young artist to have to pay an absurd amount of money to become an artist, right? Because obviously the first thing one should understand is artists, at least, I would think one would not have to think about having to be engaged into some kind, one would just make art and not worry about. But then with this kind of situation, they have to start to think about how they would pay back their loan or whatever that they take. So, and I was just with two students the other night in a bar, and one of them is also now becoming a professor. And we were just sitting there and talking about this, and then I just said, but we can just have a free school, right? That's the idea of free school. And then my idea was like, and the free school can be everywhere. So anyone who wants to be teaching and everyone who wants to be learning can come to the school. And I was saying to them, and I could just be sitting in this bar every Tuesday night, and people could just come. Because we were having a very good drink and very totally engaged about the ideas of what we were doing, so in that sense, yes, I'm like interested, but I think that it has, in a way, to, of course, understand where it is and to find a way to deal with the place it is in. And so I'm trying to find a way to be able to make this free school, and I actually mentioned it, and it's in the newspaper that I mentioned this, but so I'm trying to find, a structure always to be able to give, this space, right? And of course, people, I mean, young artists, at least in New York or in the West anyway, certainly they came to the university because it entitled them to a certain kind of name, right? Because you go to Columbia University and everybody already knows what that means, right? And so that name thing is an important part, or that the certificate or diploma, whatever, is an important part. And so, in a way, it would be interesting to find a balance of that, to be able to freely give it and then at the same time to give them some kind of structure. But yeah, I think, I mean, again, you know, one is always got to be engaged all the time and to find different ways to build that up. And I think, of course, it should be done as a community, right? It should be, you know, Malenko in Singapore and, you know. Well, thank you very much for letting us talk on forever, and I hope it was like kind of engaging and informative. And as I said, it's always open. If you have any question, you want to talk, you want to have dinner, I'm open. Thank you.